sometimes dream about solutions in the OT space where we don't need the whole internet. And I just look at this and I go, man, Solarwinds didn't need to talk to the internet either.
Welcome everyone to the Industrial Security Podcast. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm here as usual with Andrew Ginter, the Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. He's going to introduce the subject and the guest of today's show. Andrew, I hear it's a good one.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. So today, Nate, our guest is Bryan Owen. He is the security architect at OSIsoft. In my understanding, he leads the product security program at OSIsoft. OSIsoft is, of course, produces the Pi Historian and a whole family of products around it, which is, used in pretty much all industries. But I wanted to say about Bryan, I'm very happy to have him as a guest. I've known Bryan for a long time. He is very smart. He is very connected with the industry, and he is strictly fair. I've never known him to exaggerate, even when it would profit him. I've never known him to downplay a risk, even when it would profit him to downplay it. He is, in my mind, one of the most credible voices in the space. I follow him closely, in large part because he keeps me honest. Our topic today is, we're going to talk about Solarwinds, we're going to talk about supply chain, we're going to talk about current events more generally in the industrial security space. Hello, Bryan, and thank you for joining us on the podcast. Before we start, can you say a few words about yourself and about OSIsoft?
Hi, Andrew. Known Andrew for over a decade now. And looking forward to this podcast. I'm an engineer at OSIsoft. Current role is security architect. And OSIsoft is in the business of the Pi Historian, widely used for process optimization and, making sure that there's a system of record in case something goes wrong. So we've been fortunate to be in business for 40 years, so there's an awful lot of Pi systems out there. And thank you if to our listeners who have them. Appreciate it very much.
And our topic today is, let's call it current events. There's SolarWinds in the news, there's supply chain being talked about, but there's other activity in the threat environment. Can we start with SolarWinds? Can you give us an intro? What happened? What's important to you as someone who's been active in the industrial security space for a long time, and someone who's been with OSIsoft for a long time, who is a vendor in this space?
Andrew, this is a fascinating topic. I'm so glad we get to talk about this together. I guess maybe before we get too much into the overview, I would just like to start right off the bat by, real acknowledgement to the folks at FireEye who really blew the whistle on this and started a fantastic bit of, the whole community's been busy on this, and we've been sequestered for months and months. So I've been reading everything I can about it. It's kind of like a spy novel that just keeps getting better and better. With that, the gist of the supply chain attack is kind of a nightmare scenario where a trusted supplier, the SolarWinds is a network monitoring and management suite. Their Orion line in particular was compromised with a backdoor that got distributed in signed software, and they're a very large company. I think market cap of $1 billion. With for a while they were talking tens of thousands of downloads of this software, but it looks like a very surgical attack for the second payload, if you will, for who was actually exploited. So once the software was downloaded and installed, it did call home, and if you were a entity of interest, you got the present of your own C2 server and additional malware. So because the SolarWinds module is trusted and credentialed on the network, like most network management tools are, that is pretty unprecedented access to these affected entities, and had a lot of people on the edge of their seats when you find out even government entities of high stature were involved with this or affected by this. So yeah, it's been reading like a spy book. The whodunit part, there's tons of people studying it. I think one of the most fantastic pieces too is that the call outs to the command and control servers did this domain name generation thing that was reversed engineered, and the community of researchers that came together to really start publishing here's who received the payloads and so forth has been really fantastic dimension to watch as well.
So it's been in the news a lot lately, but just in case some listeners are catching up, the SolarWinds attack was an attack presumed to have been carried out by a Russian APT on the IT management software company SolarWinds. They were presumed to have used exploits in Microsoft products to get into this company SolarWinds, whose clients we now know involve a lot of U.S. government agencies and major corporations. And through software updates from SolarWinds' Orion software, they were able to attach malware to these software updates to get them into higher value targets. So it really is a complicated supply chain attack insofar as they went from Microsoft to SolarWinds to some really high value targets.
That's right. We have touched on SolarWinds before. I mean, we had Dr. Baugh on talking about NERC-CIP 013, which is the supply chain standard for the, NERC is the North American Power Grid Critical Infrastructure Protection Standard. Dr. Baugh really looked at the question of SolarWinds from a compliance perspective, saying, what do we have to do about supply chain security, because this was a supply chain incident, and really address the question: would the measures in the NERC-CIP program, the mandatory measures, have prevented something as sophisticated as the SolarWinds attack? We had Terry Inglesby on. He touched on SolarWinds as well because it is in the news. His focus was partly, he was talking about the science of security. He was talking about attack trees. And the real question was, did attack trees anticipate this class of attack? And secondarily, if we have a deep understanding of attack paths into our system, the way that attack trees give us, are there steps we could take to have prevented the attack or have prevented the consequences of the attack? Brian's take on it today is more generally, what does this mean for industrial security? What are we learning from it? And again, we're branching out a bit into sort of bigger issues of supply chain and what it means for product vendors, and again, a different view of the elephant from Brian here.
And to be clear, the reason why such a story would warrant 3 episodes in a row for our podcast is by virtue of the fact that SolarWinds is probably the biggest hack in a number of years, maybe a whole decade. For those out there not entirely familiar, we're talking about an APT who, over the course of, I believe, 9 months last year, from March to December, had just about entirely unabated access to some of the highest level government agencies in the US, as well as some major corporations.
That's right. And, the goal of the SolarWinds attack appears to have been espionage, appears to have been, theft of information. But it's alarming to anybody in the industrial space, because the SolarWinds Orion product is a management system. It lets enterprise security people manage security settings on firewalls, security settings on routers, configurations of networks, and that includes a lot of industrial firewalls, a lot of industrial systems, industrial network components are managed by the SolarWinds product. So these people had the ability to, do a lot of nasty stuff. I'm not aware of any industrial site that went down because of the SolarWinds attack. I am aware of industrial sites that had the security update installed on equipment in the industrial site and had to be cleaned out afterwards. I am aware of a lot of industrial sites that are thinking about, what does this mean? We dodged the bullet this time. Are we going to dodge it next time? What are we going to do about this? There's a lot of people out there asking, what are we going to do about this? It's big news. Let me add to what you said there. Credit to FireEye for finding it and blowing the whistle. But they also promptly notified the SolarWinds folks, and I believe less than 24 hours later, SolarWinds had an alert out, upfront and detailed. So kudos to them too in terms of notifying the community and helping out with the incident response.
Absolutely, I think a number of security companies have been involved with this as we find out more. Maybe a half a dozen or more so far, but I think the earliest one credited with spotting it was Palo Alto Networks, but their report to SolarWinds didn't have enough apparently to actually identify the cause. So again, this is one of these classic cases where the compromise environment is measured in months, if not years. I think some of the earliest recorded things on the timeline are back in summer of 2019. So, but the actual supply chain compromise had a more limited window, I think, from early 2020 to the fourth quarter, about November, December.
And in my understanding of the situation, there were more than 10,000 sites or enterprises downloaded the software update and presumably applied it. There were much smaller estimates. I saw like between 1 and 200 sites that were actively exploited because the command and control center had started sending the malware commands instead of just sitting there waiting for a command and not doing anything. I have not heard of any industrial sites shutting down, suffering consequences beyond having to clean some of their systems out. Does this mean, though, that does that agree with your understanding, and B, does this mean that in terms of industrial security that we're off the hook?
Oh, Andrew, so everyone is holding their breath that nothing more dangerous has been left behind, because the level of access that was achieved with this backdoor was full access. But what is known, or at least widely reported, is a lot of espionage activity. So it very well could end that way, or there still may be some presence left behind that haven't been surfaced yet. If it turns out what we understand about nation state patterns is that perhaps this is not sabotage, would probably be a happy ending at this point, but a very strong showing by the adversary for sure. They won this round.
So the key distinction in the point that Bryan just made is that the SolarWinds attack was largely espionage, not sabotage, which means that the attackers had full access to all of these systems, but we don't necessarily know to what extent they acted negatively against them. So it's possible that the APT could have installed all kinds of backdoors that we just don't know about because we're only now discovering the true impact of what occurred.
That's right. I mean, this is classic behavior on the part of sophisticated attacks. I mean, I remember back in 2013, I was at S4. There was a presentation by Mandiant. That business was subsequently purchased by FireEye. And, they were talking about these sophisticated attacks. And they said, yeah, they get called in and they discover sort of mundane remote control malware on a half dozen machines. They identify it, they clean out the machines, and then they look around a little more saying, did we get it all? And they dig deeper and they dig harder and they find something more subtle. They find a second level of remote control malware that is hidden much more thoroughly on a different batch of machines. Well, they clean that out too. Now they're suspicious. Now they dig hard for a long time, and they find a real nasty. It's just hiding. It's thoroughly hidden. It's not even calling home. They pull it out, they analyze it, and they discover that it's going to phone home in another month or 6 weeks after their investigation is done, after everybody thinks it's all clean. Okay, they find the 4 machines it's installed on, they rip it out. Now they look hard. Weeks go by. They keep looking. They don't find anything anymore. What does that mean? Does it mean the network is clean now? You really don't know. With an adversary this sophisticated, and they start leaving stuff behind of sort of different levels of sophistication, it's nasty. I've heard people say, you get hit by one of these guys, you need to burn the building down. So digging a little deeper, the SolarWinds, the reading I've done suggested there was actually 2 pieces of malware in there. Can you go a little deeper for us?
This was a very technical compromise. So the backdoor itself that was delivered within the SolarWinds software. There's also exploitation of a vulnerability. I think the first one, the backdoor is Sunburst. Oh gosh, I'm going to blow it here. I think it's Sunspot is the exploitation of a vulnerability in the Orion product. So we have both those dimensions, and then there's additional details about both the payloads that are very interesting and what gets done. And then SolarWinds also published some really fascinating information about their build system on how this compromise happened on their side. But what I'd like to first focus in on is that both the vulnerability and the backdoor did require some communication out to the C2s. So to me, when we look at software, particularly in critical infrastructure, that should have been a red flag. And we would have expected this to have been surfaced earlier. So it's the biggest mystery about the SolarWinds compromise to me, is that call-outs to these unknown domains that had nothing to do with SolarWinds from the Orion product should have been caught. And surprisingly, even at FireEye, what caught their attention was post-exploitation activity involving registration of new devices and that kind of activity once the adversary was unleashed on their network. So certainly there should have been opportunity to catch it earlier, and feels like a miss. Does that sound right to you?
It does, and in particular, the breadth of hundreds of I'm told the number I saw was between 100 and 200 sites, many of them government sites that were exploited. You'd think that at least some of these sites would have been fairly aggressive in terms of their security monitoring. So yeah, it's but intrusion detection is not really, it's something I did 10 years ago. It's something I follow. It's not really my current field of expertise.
Yeah, we sometimes dream about solutions in the OT space where we can, we don't need the whole internet to do everything that we do in control systems. And we talk about why is a control system connected to the internet? It doesn't need it, et cetera, et cetera. And I just look at this and I go, man, SolarWinds didn't need to talk to the internet either. It was doing a very specific network monitoring task. So this just stands out. And I'll be blatant enough to say if they would have had a strong perimeter protection like Waterfall makes, it wouldn't have been able to talk out. And we know firewalls can stop these things from egressing as well. So somewhere there was an any rule, or our blind eye turned just saying blind trust to whatever this network management software wants to do. That should be a big lesson learned that comes out of this. I think we'll see a lot more people prioritizing egress rules in their perimeter defenses.
Maybe I misheard there, but I heard Bryan say that the SolarWinds malware didn't need to be internet connected, but by virtue of the kind of attack it needed to beacon back to the attackers, right?
Yeah, I think you've misunderstood what he said. What I heard him say was that the SolarWinds Orion product, might need to connect to some of the SolarWinds websites or cloud services to do what it does. But that product had no business connecting to random sites on the internet. And so, IT best practice, industrial best practice is when you have a server, an important function like that, that piece of software really belongs on a machine by itself. Buy yourself another machine, put it on the network, put that software on it. And now, this, in a sense, the software has an IP address because it's the only thing running on a machine with an IP address. And now you can go to the firewall and say, look, anytime that machine tries to reach out to random places on the internet, the only place it can talk to is the SolarWinds website. If it tries to talk to anybody else, raise a high priority alarm, because that machine should never be connecting out to the internet. And that was missed. That either wasn't set up or the alarm was raised and, it wasn't noticed or it was investigated and they dismissed it. So, best practice should have caught this. I do agree, especially the suspicious domain names. I mean, the traffic to those domains was disguised as sort of normal, I forget the exact term, but it was normal sort of diagnostic traffic coming out of the SolarWinds product. This is, the kind of messages looked normal. The malicious content was embedded in these normal looking messages. But yeah, connections from servers to the internet shouldn't happen. And I know that many industrial customers have SolarWinds Orion components deployed on their industrial networks. And so presumably, at least some of these would have applied the security update sooner or later and had the malware, phone home, beacon out to the command and control center, or at least attempt to, and presumably be foiled by the firewall. When that happens, you get a log entry saying, just denied access to this domain name that you've never heard of before from one of the servers in your control system. You would think that this would alert someone to, something weird is going on.
I totally agree. And, to their credit, these, especially the government entities, they have some very sophisticated intrusion detection systems. I think the Einstein system and the CRISP system would have been in scope for at least some of these affected government entities, and maybe some of the industrial ones. And you wonder, how that traffic wasn't spotted. And some of the theories I've seen is that, okay, cool trick. Don't try any command and control traffic, no egress for a couple weeks. So maybe there was a machine learning period that somehow after 2 weeks it said, well, that there must not be anything wrong with that. And then it was allowed to go out with some kind of any rule. It just didn't make sense to me. There should have been enough time to learn it properly. The other theory is that, well, a lot of these destinations, it's not like they were blatantly going across to the internet to another country. They were going to cloud providers. So at least it looked like maybe they weren't checking by domain name. Maybe they were checking by IP address range. Could it have been something like that allowed it to sneak through those systems? So some of those lessons learned will end up in some details that will hopefully improve intrusion detection in the future. But for now, we would have liked to have seen better results from such an advanced system. So
I agree. My own preoccupation, though, is intrusion prevention rather than intrusion detection. So, can we talk about, looking forward? What does this mean for prevention? What should industrial sites be doing looking forward? In light of the learnings from this attack, and eventually, let's talk about what should vendors be doing.
That's it's always the uncomfortable question. I think the elephant in the room here, Andrew, is that as hard as we try, software is not yet perfect. Software development is not yet a perfect profession, and there will be certainly vulnerabilities in complex software. With the long-tailed dependencies in modern software, we probably need to expand that to include the idea that there will be some kind of unintended, unwanted code. Call it a backdoor if you want, but the idea that code can be implanted without a supplier knowing it is a problem that needs to be solved still. So what does that mean for a company that has to operate the software and critical infrastructure? It does mean they need to look at these prevention measures as you're suggesting. Now, it won't stop with prevention. We'll want to, I don't know if you've been following the software bill of materials kind of initiative, but the idea of we just can't accept software and trust it blindly. We'll want to know what's in it. And we'll want to know what's in it from the point of view of, have these bits been tampered with? Hashes and signatures and so forth, down to, the ingredients. And right now, breaking those into individual files and then into all the different software that went into those files seems to be the method that will be easiest to automate. So I think that'll come first. So once we have visibility into the software, it'll be much easier to make trust decisions in terms of how much inspection needs to be done, how much oversight needs to be done about the operation of the software. But ultimately, in the end, and we have this problem in ICS, is we have to worry about our software being legitimate functions being abused. So we'll never get out of the business of having to closely monitor how the software operates once it's in
So yeah,
production.
the software bill of materials concept makes a lot of sense to me. We need to know where the bits are coming from. The vendors, need to know where their own bits are coming from. They need to communicate that to the customers. Sometimes there's chains, there's whole trees of vendors. Suppliers supplying other vendors, supplying others, who eventually add up to very large systems that we kind of like to know where all the pieces come from, and how current all the pieces are, which vulnerabilities might apply to us in these complex systems. But it gets more complicated than that. As the largest systems out there, it's hard to avoid using any open source software. Open source is such a big thing nowadays. And the thing about open source is that, in principle, anybody can get involved in helping produce the source code, which introduces, a degree of risk, a degree of uncertainty that we just don't have when development is being done in-house in vendors. I know there's some initiatives in this regard. Can you talk about what's going on in the open source world?
Oh, this is exciting. What's going on with Linux Foundation and Microsoft to address this problem, and I want to properly position this as direction. Now, to a certain extent, there's success, and there's solutions that have been able to implement things like reproducible builds, and dependency tracking and so forth. But it's still it's hard. It's a hard road, and we're talking about years for companies to get proficient in this, and for tool chains to get provision for this. But to dive into the concept of reproducible build, you could go all the way back, I suppose, to the Ken Thompson paper about reflections on trusting trust. Right. Well, if a compiler builds a program, can you trust that program? And the idea with reproducible builds is essentially decentralizing all that, and it's kind of perfect for the open source community, because if you have source code in all these different repositories, and you're able to build it in separate environments and have it come out with binary exactly the same bits, it's believed that will go a long way to solving this problem. And indeed, when we look at how the Solarwinds, what we've known about how the build system was compromised, that solution, reproducible builds, would have exactly been able to detect some tampering in one build environment, but not another. And that's pretty exciting to have finally solved this decades old kind of Turing test that Ken Thompson came up with. And what's involved is, it's a very nuanced technical problem. I would encourage anyone to review Mark Rusinovich's talk at RSA in 2020, where he gives an overview of this. But the idea is that things embedded in your software that would prevent this kind of binary comparison are things like timestamps. Think of how hard it is going to be to go through projects and make sure that the timestamps are all set to a static number that can be compared across diverse build environments. Right? That's the kind of challenge we're talking about, and people have figured out how to do it. There's a lot that will need to happen before that propagates all the way into application supply chain makers. But the fact that Linux Foundation and Microsoft, the fact that the operating system folks are getting this down is a huge achievement and something to look forward to. In the meantime, um, some of the low-hanging fruit is really to lock down these build environments, and I think one of the reasons that supply chain has become attractive is because let's face it, some of the companies you work with, Andrew, they've gotten to be hard targets. And really the best way to go after them is, maybe the only way to go after them, is through softer targets in their supply chain. So as we take things like multi-factor authentication and make sure that's applied all throughout build environments, we should get the same effect, right? It's going to be very difficult to compromise supply chains without without it being a nation state actor, basically. And essentially, one of the big strategies we like at OSIsoft is these two-person rules, right? A lot of procedural steps around being able to protect code repositories and build code and so forth. We don't want to have a single point of failure where things can go wrong.
Waterfall Security Solutions is the OT security company. In our latest report, we look back at 2020. We observed that the most important threats in 2020 were targeted ransomware, supply chain breaches, and cloud connectivity. We pull these threats together into 4 new kinds of blended attacks. Then we look at different kinds of cyber defenses, and we determine how effective these defenses are against each of these modern attacks. To access these insights into today's threats and what can be done about them, please download our report at waterfall-security.com/2020report.
So, Nate, let me give you a little background on that. Ken Thompson is one of the pioneers of computer science. He and Dennis Ritchie wrote the first copy of the Unix operating system. They invented the C programming language. They eventually were given the Turing Award, which is, in a sense, the Nobel Prize for computer science. And in his acceptance speech, Ken Thompson talked about trusting trust. He said, look, what if I embed a virus into the C compiler? You know, the compiler is what translates the C programming language into executables. I write my virus into the source code of the C compiler. I compile the compiler with the virus in it, and then I erase the source code to the virus. And what the virus does is every program that the C compiler compiles, it inserts the virus into. Eventually, the C compiler is used to compile a new version of itself, and it inserts the virus into itself. Now, there's no source code for the virus anywhere. There's no evidence anywhere that this virus exists other than this binary for the virus that keeps propagating itself, from one version of the C compiler to another, and from every piece of source code into the executable, because the C compiler keeps inserting it into everything it compiles. And how would you detect something like this? And this is where this concept of reproducible builds comes in. In the open source world, anybody can start, inserting source code into things. But even, a lot of people in the open source world, they're not going to download huge amounts of source code and try and build that code themselves. They just download an executable. What if someone has tampered with the build system? Just like the SolarWinds build system was tampered with. What if someone's tampered with the build system to insert a nasty into the binary, even though it does not exist in the source code? How would you detect that in these very complicated build environments? That's what we're talking about here. A reproducible build is where you can take the same source code, build it somewhere else on a different, system, but produce an executable, and now compare the executables. If you do this today, the executables, the compare tool is always going to come back and say they're different. because they are. There's timestamps are different. There's subtle, spurious differences that are inserted into these very complicated binary artifacts by the build system. And so you cannot compare them. And so, another tool in terms of, advancing supply chain security is this concept of a reproducible build, where you can build it somewhere else and wind up with a bit for bit exactly the same executable as, the one that's being distributed. And if you see a difference, you can say, just a minute, that's not supposed to happen. Something fishy is going on. And you've got a fighting chance of detecting these nasties that have been inserted into products in the build process as opposed to in the source code. So coming back to the software bill of materials, there's a lot of effort and energy being invested into this. And, it seems like a useful initiative. Is it going to solve the supply chain problem? I mean, I struggle to see how a software bill of materials would have helped with the SolarWinds breach.
Right, Andrew. I'm glad you asked that, because this particular build environment compromise would not have been picked up by the software bill of materials approach. So I think it points out that there are a lot of people working on it. There's a lot of talks about software bill of materials. SBOM is in every security conference, and it deserves the attention it's getting. And but it's not a silver bullet, and we don't want to position it as such. It's really infrastructure that we need in order for everyone to really be able to do the things that we need to do for reproducible builds, to be able to properly respond. One of the big problems people had is just not even knowing what kind of software they have in their environment. And so software bill of materials is kind of this infrastructure glue. And I look at it almost in phases of capabilities that I expect to see. Is, the first one is, are these the bits that I think they are, right? And that's going beyond just a digital signature or a hash. It's, understanding kind of the contents in a granular way. And then the next question that I think about, progression from, hey, are these the right ones, is knowing if we're actually running the bits we think we're running. And now you look at, well, how do I actually apply that in the more operational sense? Are there I remember you giving a talk at S4 about whitelisting, and that's where I'm going with this. Is we have to get to a place in critical infrastructure where we know exactly what bits are running. Because hey, even though in SolarWinds it's been reported that some of the C2 commands came down as non-executables, right? They were bundled up in JPEGs and stenography kind of things. We still face this problem in a lot of cases of malicious DLLs, and people just don't know what code is running on their systems. And then the last piece, once we get those two competencies of actually knowing what's in the code and knowing what's actually running, the last one is that hard one: is, are the bits really any good, or basically, can I still trust them? Because we know over time there's kind of bit rot where vulnerabilities emerge, exploits emerge, problems emerge in software, and it needs servicing, or maybe they haven't kept up with the latest mitigations in ASLR and so forth. So we don't have to work on 1, 2, and 3 one at a time serially. We can work on those in parallel, but in my mind, I lay them out in that order because I think it's easier tackle the first one, and that last one for are the bits any good? Can I still trust them? That's going to take a long, long time, and SBOM is a huge part of answering all three of those questions.
So Nate, let me jump in here and just paraphrase, because I think this is sort of a great way to sum up how this all fits together. The SBOM, the software bill of materials, helps, but it's in a sense the first step. It says, where do the bits come from? I might have bits from this vendor, from that vendor. I might have nested vendors. This vendor bundles a bunch of stuff from 4 other vendors, which bundle stuff from 3 other vendors. So where do they come from is one part of the question. The next part is, are those really the bits we're running? And he mentioned my presentation, whitelisting at S4. This was a number of years ago. I demonstrated how to attack a whitelisting system by using scripted code. I would have an interpreter running. I might even have a script running, and the script would itself download additional script. That script would come in as text. Script is just text. And then you interpret the text as if it were commands. So really, you're running code that you thought was text. In a lot of these compromises, you will actually, the bad guys will download code into the malware while it's running and inject the code into memory and start executing the code. So the code you're looking at in terms of the product you purchased and the SBOM you're looking at may not be the code you're running, because you've downloaded other stuff and you're running it now. And the third one is, even if you understand where everything came from, even if you understand that you really are running what you think you should be running, now the question becomes, can I trust that stuff? And he's talking about, in the industrial space, we tend to leave stuff running for much longer than is wise, because we're focused on safety and reliability risks, and we don't really consider the security risks that come from leaving stuff in place for a long time, long enough for the bad guys to discover vulnerabilities, long enough for the encryption algorithms to become out of date because they've been broken by the bad guys, and so on. So, 3 steps. Yes, the SBOM, understand what you're running. But number 2, figure out, are you really running that stuff, or did some other stuff arrive out of nowhere and now you're running it? And number 3, even if we do understand completely what we're running, is it still any good? Some of what you just said, reminds me of an episode about a year ago with Matt Gibson at EPRI. And, one of his bottom lines was, guys, we have to know our systems. We have to know how they're supposed to work. We have to know what pieces are supposed to be there. We have to know our systems better than our enemies do. If it's the other way around, we're at a serious disadvantage.
Oh, Andrew, I love that from Matt, and he's in good company with Rob Joyce, who gave a similar presentation at Enigma a few years back. But he basically said that's what the adversary is going to do. They try to know our systems better than we know them, and to an extent, when we look at SolarWinds build system breach, that was almost an example of the adversary knowing how that build system worked almost better than the software supplier. And I mean no disrespect to SolarWinds. This is a serious adversary, but when you study just how tricky that was, and the fact that the some of the artifacts were cleaned up midstream, right? So if SolarWinds didn't have a way to go back and do the forensics on older systems, they would have missed this. So it's exactly right. Matt is right. We need to know our systems inside and out, upside down. I really love the work that Matt's done on the EPRI technical assessment methodology. It provides a structured way for people to get to know their systems better. It provides a structured way for suppliers like OSIsoft to give people a running start. Here's a cybersecurity data sheet that gives you a standardized way of understanding the system from a security perspective. So that's a very astute assessment, and clearly fits in with our discussion about SBOMs. You want to know you know your system very well.
So thank you, Bryan. This has been very useful. Before we part ways here, is there a thought you'd like to leave with our listeners?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. This is always so much fun talking with you. We haven't been able to see each other at conferences for the obvious reasons, but this has been fun. One of the things about the SolarWinds incident that I really would like to close on is that we really not take a knee-jerk reaction to this. And in particular, I'm very concerned that supply chain paperwork will dominate the reaction, and really the paperwork itself is not going to be helpful. I think when we really start working closely with our customers, we find out there's a lot more low-hanging fruit that needs to be addressed, and the message for the supply chain attacks is to really join the community and get involved in initiatives like SBOM, use services like Adolis Fact or Finite State. These learn more about your systems and focus your energies there instead of paperwork and contracts and silly requirements that thou shalt not put any backdoors and so forth. This is all kind of 101 stuff, and it's busy work. We've got serious work that needs to be done. We need to understand our systems better. We can't get buried down with bureaucracy and knee-jerk reactions to this attack.
Andrew, you want to wrap things up here with a thought?
Sure. Bryan finished here by mentioning paperwork and supply chain paperwork. This was what Joe Bogg was talking about with NERCSIP 013. There's a lot of record keeping you have to do for your supply chain, and I think I'm going to paraphrase Bryan here that that's a lot of work and not a lot of benefit. The real benefit comes from understanding what bits are you executing, understanding are they really the bits you're executing or did something get injected just now, and understanding, okay, if they really are the bits I'm executing, are they still any good? All three of those questions are more important than the paperwork as to who did I buy these bits from. So, I thought that was a useful insight, and it sounds like there's quite a bit of work left to do on sorting this out.
Agreed. Thanks to Bryan Owen for speaking with you, Andrew, and thank you, Andrew, for speaking with me.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Nate.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thanks to everyone listening.